How I Got Here, the inside stories of startups and innovation in travel and transportation, with your hosts, PhocusWire's Kevin May and Mozio's David Litwak.
Hello there and welcome to another episode of How I Got Here. This is Mozio and PhocusWire's inside stories around innovation and startups in travel and transportation. We're delighted for this latest episode to be joined by Stephan Ekbergh. He's the CEO of the Travelstart group based in South Africa, but formerly from Scandinavia, Sweden in particular. He's got a really interesting backstory, which is why we've invited him on here for this show. So first of all, a very warm welcome, Stephan. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Kevin. Great to be here.
Okay, right. So as always with these, we start with the question and we ask for you to give us a kind of a succinct overview, and that's how did you get here?
Yeah, how did I get here? It's like that David Byrne song. That was the first thing I thought about when you asked that. So I thought about that, and I think it's through a series of, maybe fortunate or unfortunate, not necessarily connected events that got me to where I am today. Because, when I look back for what I intended to do and what I'm doing today, I got derailed, quite a lot. So obviously, but I think, the ingredients are basically the following. One is a bankruptcy in Scandinavia's largest consolidator. It's a encounter with CompuServe that knocked me off my feet. It's a broken payphone access charge model. Another thing is a dismissal by investors. I think another piece of the puzzle is an intervention by God, to be honest.
Okay.
Also, I think an adventure in search of a treasure somewhere, and of course my favorite topic, 9/11. So I think that's sort of when you put those pieces together, that's how I got to where I am today. And if you want me to deep dive on some of these topics, I'd be happy to. But if you want to take that as a starting ground, I'm more than happy to. So
well, let me ask you this, Stephan. Do you consider yourself to be lucky, or do you consider yourself to be unlucky? Because it is a series of, as you and I have spoken many times before, there's been a series of unfortunate events that have led you to where you are. Do you consider yourself a lucky or unlucky person?
I consider myself one of the luckiest guys in the world, to be honest. So yeah, I do.
And that's because you've always managed to pick yourself up from the pitfalls that you've faced over the years, is it?
Yeah, but I also think, one of the things that I always talk about is sort of a little bit my naivety, and I never thought about it, but I see it in my youngest daughter, her naivety when, things hits her. She's sort of unaware about the fact that actually things went really shit now, Okay, you actually have no friends at school. Aren't you worried about that? No. And I never thought about it, but I thought, what, I'm a little bit like her. I'm sort of, I don't always think about the fact that, oh my gosh, this is actually a catastrophe here. And so I tend not always to be aware of how things are, because I'm sort of normally always on a bit of a mission.
Mm-hmm. That's that's blatantly clear to anyone who's ever met you, I would say, and I say that in a positive way. So let's go back to the early days. Now I would say it's probably fairly well known that you had a successful and budding DJ career in your early days, which is fairly well documented. But I'm kind of interested in that kind of shift from that into frankly, getting into online travel. So if you can kind of talk us through those steps, because we're all amateur DJs these days, but it's a fairly sizable jump in careers and pivot, if we're allowed to use that word, to go from one to the other.
At the end of the day, it's not that big of a difference, because it's sort of, when I worked as a DJ, you got to remember that I started back in the early days of Saturday Night Fever, and the equipment that you had back in those days, they were hacks. So basically, before every gig, when you were in a club, you had to be under the console, fixing the wires, and sometimes we found some sort of fuse box or something to connect to the mixer board to have different sounds. So there was actually somehow a lot of technology involved in that in the early days. And another thing also that people tend to forget is that when you play in front of an audience, you have to be extremely customer focused, because if you don't, you will be very soon out of fashion. Or if you're not in tune with what they're doing, you at least have to know, okay, what is the next trend is going, and you have to be good enough and you have to be influential enough to create that trend. And so there are, I would say, a lot of similarities with the world of business and innovation in general, and being a DJ, and being a good DJ, I'm talking about now, not just any Tom, Dick, and Harry, of course. But
indeed. But I suppose the interesting thing is that the technical aspects, tick that. The customer focused part, knowing when to spin the right tunes, and becoming customer focused with an online travel agency. But the entrepreneurial part of that, is that something that you learned as well, or would you have considered yourself to be an entrepreneurial disc jockey?
The thing is that first of all, a DJ is only as good as their last gig. So you have to perform all the time, and you can't. It's not a job. Because if you fall behind, there are other younger, better talented who will take your job in the booth where you're playing. So you have to sort of constantly be on the ball, and you also, at least in those days, you have to negotiate with dodgy characters all the time. So you come into a room with half naked ladies, and club owner is half stoned, and so you negotiate with dodgy characters basically all the time. And in those days, you negotiated with the record labels as well, because you wanted to get all the records for free. So you had to, and those guys had a lot of power back in those days. And obviously there's a whole bunch of stuff that you need to negotiate the whole time. So you are an entrepreneur because you're on your own. There is no job security.
So I'm going to make maybe an obvious segue about dodgy characters. Once you did make that shift from being a DJ into online travel, did you come across, dare I say, shady characters in those early days, simply because what you were doing was very new?
One of my first partner, he was basically he was a very, very shrewd business guy, and he owned a bucket shop. And for those guys who listen in on this who doesn't know what a bucket shop is, it's basically normally a travel agency located on a high street in a major city, and they're often run by Persians or people from Chile. Sometimes they were from Spain, or often India. And they normally target their own population going home for their annual trips. And these bucket shops, they often have special deals with some carriers, or they have ways of finding airline tickets that most people don't. So obviously bucket shops are largely gone today. Thank God for that, by the way. But and these guys, they are completely shady. Often their businesses are illegal, and sometimes their businesses is, doing other stuff besides selling travel. So it could be importing stuff, exporting stuff. Sometimes it's substance involved, and so my first partner that I had was one of these guys, and the thing was, like with most people, he had two sides. One really wonderful and charming and completely adorable side, and one really dark side. And I think by the time I got in, he was wanted in Spain for, rape or, murder or something like that. I can't really remember. And often his airline negotiation, ended with him, shouting at them, screaming at them, throwing stuff at them, and often, they had all their various ways of trying to find ways to make money outside of the Swedish tax system, and a lot of it was, of course, always in cash. So one of the guys went across the border to Denmark once a week with a briefcase full of cash to buy airline tickets. And often, to be honest, the country managers of the various airlines, they were often in on the deals. So, and you could see that by them, driving, beautiful Bentleys and stuff like that, and having fur coats and, expensive, thick, Rolex watches. These airline managers, and often, the actual CEO of, for instance, Swiss Air, when he came to visit this little shop in Malmo with two employees, he realizes that, my gosh, this country manager here is much more well off than I am. Now, how is this working? But there was so much money floating, under the table, beside the table, underhand dealings, left and right. That I got very intrigued by this industry back in those days. I must say that there was so much money floating around. So what I managed to do, what nobody else had really thought about, was that I thought that I want to get normal mainstream customers. I want them to come and buy a ticket without all the shadiness. So what I managed, so I built this brand called International Tours, which became like the largest, consolidator in Scandinavia, and a very reputable brand. Everybody bought from us, and so that was it was a bucket shop with a beautiful brand on steroids, without all the dodgy dealings and all this strange stuff. So it was basically just I cleaned up the model and made it mainstream. And but as I said in the beginning, a bankruptcy in Scandinavia's largest consolidator, we later went bankrupt, and that has its own backstory. But I don't know if I want to go into that now, but because it's anyway. So yeah.
So you mentioned about 5 or 6 different things, and you said something about a CompuServe and the 911. So you just touched on the largest travel consolidator, and I guess I was actually confused by that. I thought that was a different travel consolidator. It sounds like it was your travel consolidator.
Yeah.
What about some of the other influences?
Okay, so obviously I can tell you. So after my company, I'd actually sold it. So, but the new owners, unfortunately, the company went bankrupt. But afterwards, sort of travel and music was the only 2 things that I knew. But I thought I didn't want to go back to the music part. And I thought travel intrigued me, not so much the actual traveling, because I never chose this profession because I love travel. I actually don't really care much about it, but I love the fact how broken it is to use a Google word, and there was always so much to do, and so that's why I really liked it. Now, anyway, sort of after this bankruptcy, a friend of mine come over from America, and I just bought the first Apple laptop that came out, and and he showed me CompuServe, and I was blown away. I mean, I had this thing where you could dial up certain things, but CompuServe was something different, and there was a travel section there which I logged into, and boom, lo and behold, there was a Sabre green screen, and I was ecstatic because I knew, of course, how to make a like a long entry booking, which you needed to do there. There was no real user interface, and once I've concluded this booking to Paris, I was like, flip, this is incredible. You just need to make this easier for people, for those who don't know how to do these commands. So that was a total revelation for me. I mean, I remember it so well. I think it was 95. I think it was July 20. It was like lightning struck me or something like that. And that was really a beautiful moment.
So interestingly, we're hearing lots of pinging here, because for those, we're not recording this live, but in a couple of weeks when this goes out, we're just hearing that Mark Åkerström, the CEO of Expedia, has resigned, and his CFO as well. So that's probably why we're hearing lots.
Are you kidding me?
Yeah, exactly. So this is what happens when you record live during the news day. So we probably shouldn't go into it in great detail, because we don't know anything about it as such. And but yeah, that may be listeners why we're getting lots of pinging from people's computers here. I mean, we can maybe discuss it another time. But I mean, interestingly, Stephan, if you could talk us through, you built a really successful business in Scandinavia, and it was growing, and dare I say, you said there was lots of money kicking about, and things were, in inverted commas, comfortable. How did you kind of see that period in terms of your own kind of personal success? Is that something that you were thinking, I've got a long and glittering career ahead of me? Or did you always have some kind of vision or aspiration to kind of move on? And we can come to the moving on when you move to South Africa in a little while. But I'm just get a sense of, you've always come across as somebody who doesn't like to sit still for very long. Did you ever have a sense that you were feeling very comfortable with how things were going with Travelstart in Scandinavia?
No, I mean, I've heard this quite a few times here, that I'm more of a wartime guy than a peacetime guy. And, if there is no chaos, I will create chaos just, to have some stuff happening. And I think that's a trait that most entrepreneurs to some degree have. I think that, obviously, See, the thing is that after the bankruptcy, the industry in Sweden, they treated me like pariah, like I had leprosy or something like that. Then when I had success with Travelstart, of course, then I was celebrated. I was the best thing since sliced bread, and I've sort of always didn't care about those things, to be honest. But for me, it was more a little bit of a journey. How far can you take certain things, and what can you learn in the process? What's beyond the horizon and stuff like that. So I mean, that was always very. I mean, the journey was always very, very important to me, and I liked that challenge.
And what would you have said was probably the hardest task of overseeing that company and growing it at the same time?
Are we talking about my Scandinavian business now?
Yes, yeah.
I think the absolutely toughest thing was that we wanted to build this rocket ship or Ferrari or whatever you want to call it. But the problem was that there was not even gravel roads in those days. So there was no payment connectors. There was no easy way how to get on the internet. Even actually accessing internet was a problem in those days. Suppliers, they didn't know what we were talking about. GDSs didn't know what we were talking about. So everything, you needed to hack everything. And that was, of course, that was wonderful, because you created something out of nothing. And so by the time we started Mr. Jet, for instance, so this is just prior to Travelstart. So when we started that, obviously, Expedia, was doing business, and Travelocity was doing business. PC Travel might have just shut down, and there were a few others in America. I don't think that Last Minute had even started when we got going. And so you needed to invent everything from scratch. And that was really wonderful in many ways, because so once I got fired from there, starting up Travelstart, I sort of knew how to do things and navigate things. Then, it was more about, okay, so I've got access to supply now, I've got content, people can pay, et cetera, and how can we do this better? And now how will we get traffic? So that was, of course, a different challenge, and it's a challenge that the whole industry has today, of course. I like that journey, and it was, so basically you had to invent everything, from scratch, and that was just something that we enjoyed doing.
So I want to quickly summarize here. So you did international tours first, and then Mr. Jet was the second, and that was is that correct? That's Scandinavia only, and then it was Travelstart after that. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, it was Travelstart after that. And so bear in mind, there was a couple of projects in between international tours and Mr. Jet as well. So we were working on this pay phone access, charge model, and when the first browser came out, it was pretty obvious that we should just move everything to the internet instead. But the problem was that there was nobody on the internet in those days. It was just a thing. So it took time before time caught up with us. But in Scandinavia, at least, I remember it so well. The pivotal moment for online travel, the first iteration was really 9/11, because that's when people flocked to the internet to find good deals. And so that was really, great for us, because there was lots of deals out there. There was lots of capacity. They wanted to do business with everybody, especially the airlines. And so that was actually a pivotal moment for us, for the whole industry.
So sorry, you mentioned something there, and I just want to go a little deeper on it. You said that this pay by phone kind of stuff. So was that Mr. Jet, and then when you transitioned to, when you had your aha moment seeing the Sabre screen, that's when you started Travelstart? And I would love to hear a little bit more about that transition, because it seems like an interesting in-between phase between offline and online.
So I'll tell you what the in-between phase was. So I had the international tours. Then the next thing was I encountered, CompuServe. But, before, conceptually, I didn't even know what a freaking graphical user interface was, but between that and the first, browser experience, how we developed something, was actually, we did this, payphone access charge model, where you basically, you had these menus, click, or press 1 if you want to go from Stockholm, press 5 if you want to go to London. So you can just imagine, sometimes they had to wait like 7 minutes before their choice came up. So that wasn't sustainable. So I partnered with the largest media corporation in Sweden to put these menus on in their papers, so people could immediately access. Okay, press 1 if you want to go to Stockholm. Press 27 if you want to go to Malaga, for instance. And so because it was the menus were too complicated. Now, we made some money doing this because there was a lot of novelty and nobody had really done this before. And basically, what we did was we took all the information from the newspapers about all the last minute information that was available, and we just dumped that into a database, and then people could access that. But of course it got very expensive for the end consumer and tedious and complicated. And then sort of the first browser came up, and I hacked together a business plan with a friend of mine that a company invested in, and that became Mr. Jet, which then sort of became the household name online travel in Scandinavia, at least at the time. I got fired from there, and then I started Travelstart. So that's how it all happened.
Very interesting. I want to quickly touch on something you briefly mentioned. You said you were a pariah in Sweden after the first failure. I think it's, always interesting for our listeners, especially because in travel, it's not like the rest of startup world, so based in Silicon Valley. I remember when we started this podcast, someone said, "Oh, you should do all your interviews in person." And I kind of laughed. I was like, "Yeah, well, unless I want to be flying all around the world, that's not going to happen." And what we recognize is, like, people are starting businesses in all different places around the world. And I've heard it's a phrase applied to Scandinavia in particular called the tall poppy syndrome, which is if you stick your head kind of above the fray, you'll get it chopped off. And this idea that, like, looking down on ambition. And I'm curious if you could maybe delve a little bit, how much of that, you being a pariah, would you think had to do with kind of societal, norms?
Well, I mean, a lot, because obviously, I grew up in the 60s, and in the 60s and 70s, to be honest, getting a good job, even by the government, was considered, pretty okay. Today is completely different, because today everybody wants to be rock stars and influencers and, entrepreneurs. So that's changed, a lot. But in those days, it was still very much that, you shouldn't stick your chin out, because they will beat you down. But guys like Zlatan Ibrahimovic and people like that, they've changed that a lot. So today it's much more okay to try to become successful. Mind you, it's okay to be successful, but please don't show it. So you're still expected to have a modest lifestyle, even if you're successful. So that's kind of interesting. It's full of double standards and hypocrisy.
So, Stephan, you made it was going well in Scandinavia, but then you kind of changed it all and turned everything on its head and moved to South Africa, which is interesting on many levels. I mean, can you talk us through what was your thought process behind that? Was it an emotional one? Was it a financial one? Was it a strategic one? Were you bored? Did you want a new challenge? Just kind of, I think the listeners would be interested to kind of understand why, really.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. So when I listen to old episodes of How Did I Get Here, it's very interesting to listen to some people, and they explain the thought process, how they thought about something. The fact of the matter is, most of the time it's more serendipity than anything else. So, the naked truth about, our Africa transition was as follows. I was sick, dead and tired of Sweden. I felt that, number one, we had built up something really nice there. We were doing really well, and I was in search of a new adventure. And my wife was also a bit bored of sort of, our lives there. And we thought, what would happen if we just, took everything that we know, etc., and we just planted it in a new pot in South Africa, and what would then happen? So the thinking was a little bit for me was, okay, so we run this little OTA here in Sweden. Nobody knows even where Sweden is. It'll take us ages before anybody finds out about us. But at least South Africa is an English-speaking country. So maybe we could have some sort of international appeal if we're successful down there. Now, mind you, I knew that South African market wasn't that huge, but I thought, if we could take 60% of the market, that would still be a pretty big, decent business. And so that's how it went. So it was partly boredom, partly in search for an adventure, and partly search for a treasure. And a treasure could be monetary, it could be just a challenge in life. So I think that, I was never really motivated by money. So that was never my thing, but I did want to do things that sort of nobody else have thought about before. And obviously, later when we sold the business in Scandinavia, I thought that the market was kind of mature in Scandinavia. Now it was more about trying to perfect that, do that better than anybody else. And I felt, okay, this is not so interesting for me anymore. And I was lucky enough to be able to take those kind of quick decisions because I had no investors, because I never managed to raise any money. So I could take those decisions, and the company was always profitable, so I didn't need to worry about that.
Very cool. So one of the things we kind of like to ask from startups that aren't US based and are in markets where there isn't as established of a track record is kind of sort of your lost in translation moments. And for those listeners who are regular listeners, they'll remember, Stuart from ClearTrip talking about his first booking actually being offline because people misunderstood what an online travel agency was in India. And, are there any anecdotes like that you have that kind of maybe might illustrate the cultural challenges of operating in Africa?
Yeah, that's a good question. I should have thought about that. Look, I remember a whole bunch of stuff. When we started up the business in Scandinavia, I started this newsletter that we sent to decision makers in the travel industry, and it was basically about how disruption, how it would affect the industry. And one day, a CEO of a large travel company, he was so irritated with us. So he sent me an email saying, we survived the fax, and I'm sure we'll survive the internet as well. So that was kind of a funny anecdote. But I think that look, I think down here, we run across things all the time. So basically, people don't know how to spell their names. I'm sure that in other countries they have similar things. Another thing that come to think about now is that in South Africa, it's quite common. A few years back, what airlines used to do was a customer makes a booking on our website, and the airline cancels our RP, which is our ownership to the PNR. And they take over the booking and contact the customer and ask them to come to the airport and pay for it. It happened all the time, the first few years. So the airlines would simply just steal the bookings from us. So that was, one thing. Another thing, which is, I don't know if it's an anomaly here, but quite common. Some people, they buy a trip, they pay for it, they go on the trip, then they come home and say, yeah, I'm a little bit short on cash. So, they call the bank and they reverse the payment on the credit card. And then we have to prove to the bank, which is quite a tedious process, that they actually bought the ticket, they actually, did travel, et cetera, et cetera. So there has been a whole bunch of those things over the years. And then, of course, it's the usual stuff. People don't know how to, spell their names. They don't have passports, they don't have visas, they booked the wrong dates. But I think this happens to basically everybody. Yeah.
I don't know how common not spelling your own name is in other countries, but that's a little bit more out there to me. But Kevin?
Happens all the time.
So how many years now is it that you've been in South Africa?
15 years.
15 years. I mean, would you consider yourself and the business to have been a bit of a pioneer down in South Africa? And obviously you're reaching out into other countries in more recent years. Are you considered in the business community down there as kind of pioneers?
Yeah, I would say so. Look, there were guys here before us. Last Minute had been doing business down here for 6 years. Travel.com.au, I don't know if they're still around, but they've been here for 5 years when we started. And those were some of the international players that were here when we launched. So, but I think we were basically the first ones to do it right, for sure. I think there was a lot of stuff that we did that was very different. But look, I mean, our industry is mature now, and the reason that Mark and others, they resign now is because we're becoming the new dinosaurs. So, that's why all this stuff is happening very quickly.
And with that in mind, what would you say has probably been your biggest achievement with the business in Africa?
I think what I am probably pretty proud of is that we've managed to create a company and a brand that is considered a true African success. And it's one of the largest e-commerce companies on this continent, that we've managed to. Also, I think one thing that I'm pretty proud of is that when we started down here, Cape Town was at the end of the world. There was basically no tech. You couldn't find any tech talent, and so we've grown a whole lot of tech talent. And today, Cape Town is a real hub. You have all the Amazons and Facebook and tons and tons and tons of startups here. And we were sort of one of the first real pioneers in e-commerce here. And obviously some of the people that started with us, they've gone on to do phenomenal careers elsewhere. So I'm pretty proud of that.
And I suppose it would be pretty fair to say that you haven't taken in massive amounts of funding over the years, certainly with Travelstart. So what has been your approach to that, given that you got around fairly recently and after, 10, 12 years already being based in Africa?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the reason that I took in money, that was 4 years ago now, was that I felt I'm not getting any younger, and I felt that I needed to think about some sort of plan for what is next for the company, and I wanted a financial partner that could sort of partner with me on the next part of the journey. So basically, when we brought in money, we were quite a simple B2C player in the airspace. And over the last couple of years specifically, we ventured out into new categories. We're pretty big in accommodation. Now we do buses as well. We do corporate travel. So we have 10% of the corporate travel market in South Africa. And, we're quite acquisitive, and we do a whole bunch of stuff. So we want to continue to do that. We want to cover as much content and supply as possible on the African continent, and there is tons to do there still. And we want to cater for customers irrespectively of mode of transport, irrespectively of mode of holiday or why they're traveling. And eventually we might also look at people coming into Africa, so we can use our supply for them. So yeah.
Okay, and the last one then from us then, Stephan. I mean, you did reference it when you were talking about your reasons from moving from Sweden down to South Africa, and one of those was boredom. I mean, what do you do now to stop yourself being bored? And in the years that you have been down there, have you had to make some adjustments because you have started getting bored?
Oh yeah. So I mean, I do that all the time. No, I mean, I keep myself busy with looking at both new business model, and also, to be honest, how the basic B2C model is going, what that's going to look like going forward. And so I think that's I think for years there was actually not a whole lot of stuff happening in this industry that I really was energized by. But I'm energized by the fact now that there is so much commotion going on. Google is eating everybody's lunch, dinner, and breakfast and snacks as well. And so how do we look at that? How do we address that? And what other models are there that we can defend more towards that. So I think, I must say, I said to my colleagues the other day that, I don't think I've been this excited about this industry in almost 18 years as I am now. So,
okay. Well, that's great. Well, thank you ever so much for joining us, Stephan. We were out of time. Who knows? By the time this podcast comes out, you may well be the new CEO of the Expedia Group. Maybe that's what all the pinging was in the background. That was Barry Diller contacting you, asking you if you were interested in the job. But who knows? That may have. You never know. But
that would be a terrible decision. Yeah,
so. All right. Well, thanks ever so much from David and I for joining us on How I Got Here, Stephan.
All right. Thanks a lot. Thanks.
Okay. And thanks everybody for tuning in. This has been How I Got Here, another episode of our weekly podcast where we look at the innovation and stories in travel and transportation. Thanks ever so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Thanks ever so much.
Thanks for listening to the How I Got Here podcast. We'll be back next week with more insight stories behind startups and innovation in travel and transportation. Check mozio.com/move for a complete write-up of the highlights of every podcast with translations into 5 languages. And get your daily dose of news on the digital travel economy by subscribing to the newsletter at PhocusWire.com. See you next week.